So you think you know what a hero looks like, right? Maybe you're picturing some grizzled war veteran with decades of experience, or maybe a squad of elite soldiers with heavy weapons and perfect training. But what if I told you that one of the most incredible tank kills in World War II was pulled off by a 20-year-old kid from Hamilton, Ontario, armed with what was basically considered the worst anti-tank weapon the Allies ever made? Yeah, we're talking about the PIAT. And if you've ever heard of this thing, you know it was notorious for being unreliable, heavy, awkward, and just straight up dangerous to the person firing it. But this Canadian private named Ernest Smith, he didn't get the memo about how impossible his situation was. Because on October 27, 1944, he looked at a 56-ton German Tiger tank rolling toward his position and decided, you know what, I'm gonna destroy that thing myself. Now, before we get into the absolute insanity of what Ernest Smith did that day, we need to talk about what he was up against, because the Tiger tank wasn't just any tank. This was the vehicle that gave Allied soldiers nightmares. When you heard the rumble of a Tiger approaching your position, you knew you were in serious trouble. This beast weighed 56 tons. It had armor so thick that most Allied tank rounds would literally bounce off it like pebbles. And it packed an 88mm gun that could punch through pretty much any Allied tank from over a mile away. German crews knew they were driving mobile fortresses, and Allied troops knew that going up against a Tiger usually meant you were about to have a very bad day. The psychological impact alone was massive, because you could hit this thing with everything you had and watch your shots just ricochet into the dirt while it slowly turned its turret toward you. And that's when you knew it was over. So that's the Tiger. Now let's talk about what Ernest Smith had to fight it with. And oh boy, this is where it gets almost comical if it wasn't so terrifying. The PIAT stood for Projector Infantry Anti-Tank, and calling it unpopular would be like calling the ocean slightly damp. British soldiers hated this weapon. Canadian soldiers hated it. American troops who encountered it were baffled by its design. And even the guys who invented it probably had second thoughts. Here's why this thing was a nightmare to use. First off, it weighed 32 pounds, which doesn't sound that bad until you realize you're supposed to be running around a battlefield with it. Second, it had this massive spring mechanism that required 80 pounds of force to cock, meaning you basically had to use your entire body weight and stand up fully exposed just to get it ready to fire. Third, the recoil was absolutely brutal. We're talking about a weapon that would slam back into your shoulder with enough force to leave massive bruises or even break bones if you didn't brace it right. Fourth, and this is the kicker, it was wildly inaccurate past about 100 yards, so you had to get danger close to your target to have any hope of hitting it. Oh, and did I mention it was unreliable? The spring mechanism would fail, the bombs would sometimes not detonate, and in cold weather, which you know is kind of common in European winters, the thing would barely work at all. There are stories of British soldiers in Normandy just abandoning their PIATs because they were more trouble than they were worth. Some units straight up refused to carry them and preferred to take their chances with other weapons or even bare hands before they'd trust a PIAT. So when I tell you that Ernest Smith grabbed this weapon to take on a Tiger tank, you need to understand he was bringing what most soldiers considered a piece of junk to fight the most feared tank in the German arsenal. Now let's rewind a bit and talk about who Ernest Smith actually was, because this guy's story doesn't start with him being some elite commando or specially trained tank hunter. He was born in New Westminster, British Columbia in 1914 and grew up during some pretty tough times. The Great Depression hit his family hard, like it did most families, and young Ernie, as people called him, had to grow up fast. He worked odd jobs, helped support his family, and eventually ended up in Hamilton, Ontario, trying to make ends meet. When World War II broke out in 1939, Ernest did what a lot of young Canadian men did: he enlisted. He joined the Seaforth Highlanders of Canada, which was an infantry regiment with a proud history, and off he went to do his part. But here's the thing, Ernest Smith wasn't some natural-born warrior who breezed through training and impressed all his officers. He was just a regular guy doing his job. He went through basic training, learned how to be an infantryman, and shipped out to Europe with his unit. By October 1944, the Allies were pushing through Italy in what was honestly one of the most brutal campaigns of the entire war. The Italian terrain was a defender's dream and an attacker's nightmare. Mountains, steep valleys, rivers that turned into raging torrents, narrow roads that could be easily blocked, and German forces who had dug in and fortified every position imaginable. The fighting was slow, it was bloody, and it was exhausting. The Seaforth Highlanders were part of this grinding advance, and they'd already been through hell by the time they reached the Savio River area. On October 27th, the Seaforths were tasked with holding a position near the Savio River, and this is where things went sideways fast. German forces launched a counterattack, and this wasn't just infantry, this was a full combined arms assault with Tiger tanks leading the charge. Now you have to understand what this meant for the Canadian troops in that area. They were infantry dug into defensive positions with limited anti-tank capabilities, and suddenly they've got Tigers rolling toward them supported by German infantry. The sound alone must have been terrifying, that deep engine rumble, the squeaking of the tracks, the knowledge that this mobile fortress was coming to crush your position. Ernest Smith was in a forward position with his unit when the attack began, and here's where his story really starts. As the Tigers approached, most of the Canadian positions were in serious danger of being overrun. The German tactic was pretty straightforward: use the Tigers to smash through the defensive line, while infantry followed up to clear out any survivors. It was effective, it was terrifying, and it was working. Soldiers were falling back, anti-tank guns were being knocked out, and the situation was rapidly deteriorating into a potential disaster. But Ernest Smith saw what was happening and made a decision that would define his entire life. He grabbed a PIAT and decided he was going to stop that Tiger. Now remember everything I told you about the PIAT. This weapon was inaccurate past 100 yards, which meant Ernest had to let this 56-ton monster get close, really close, we're talking danger close, before he could even attempt a shot. And he had to expose himself to cock the weapon, which meant standing up in full view of German infantry and the Tiger itself. Oh, and if he missed, well, the Tiger's machine guns or main gun would make short work of him. And even if he hit the Tiger, there was no guarantee the PIAT bomb would penetrate that thick armor. The odds were stacked so heavily against him that any rational person would have said this is suicide, find cover, and hope the Tiger passes by. But Ernest Smith wasn't thinking about odds or probability. He was thinking about his buddies who were about to get killed if someone didn't do something. So he moved forward while everyone else was looking for cover. This 20-year-old private from Hamilton was moving toward the Tiger. He found a position close enough to have a shot. And this is the part that still gives me chills. He stood up, fully exposed, cocked that massive spring on the PIAT, aimed at this behemoth of a tank, and fired. The PIAT launched its bomb with that distinctive thump. And in that split second, Ernest Smith had no idea if he just signed his own death warrant or actually accomplished something. The bomb hit the Tiger, and here's where we need to talk about how anti-tank weapons actually work, because it's not like in the movies where tanks just explode in a giant fireball. The PIAT used a shaped charge warhead, which means when it detonates it creates a focused jet of superheated metal that can punch through armor. But it has to hit at the right angle, and it has to detonate properly. And even then, with a Tiger's thick armor, there's no guarantee. The bomb Ernest fired hit the Tiger, and it worked. The shaped charge penetrated the armor, and the Tiger was disabled. Now, disabled doesn't always mean destroyed, but it means the tank is out of the fight. It can't move, it can't shoot, its crew might be dead or wounded or trying to abandon the vehicle, but that Tiger was done. You'd think that would be enough, right? One impossibly lucky shot with a notoriously unreliable weapon taking out the most feared tank in the German army, surely Ernest Smith would take that win and get to cover. Nope, because there was a second Tiger and German infantry was still pushing forward. Ernest's position was now completely exposed. The Germans knew where he was, and they were directing fire at him. Machine gun rounds were cracking past him. German infantry was trying to advance on his position, and that second Tiger was moving to engage. Most people would have broken run for their lives, because staying in that position was certain death. Ernest Smith reloaded the PIAT. Yeah, you heard that right. This absolute madman stood there under fire, cocked the weapon again, which remember requires standing fully upright and exposing yourself, and got ready for another shot. The second Tiger was advancing, probably trying to figure out what had happened to the first one, and Ernest waited for it to get into range. The Tiger's turret was traversing looking for targets. German infantry was using the tank for cover, and the entire situation was chaos incarnate. Ernest aimed, fired, and scored another hit. The second Tiger was now also disabled, or at the very least forced to withdraw, depending on which accounts you read, but either way it was no longer an immediate threat to the Canadian positions. But the story doesn't end there, because Ernest Smith wasn't done fighting. With both Tigers neutralized or destroyed, the German infantry assault started to falter because their armored support was gone, but they were still there, and they were still trying to break through the Canadian lines. Ernest grabbed his rifle and started engaging German infantry. He held his position even though he was wounded at some point during this engagement. He took shrapnel or a bullet hit. No one's entirely sure of the exact details, because everything was happening so fast, but he kept fighting. He directed fire, he called out enemy positions, he held that forward spot, and basically told the German attack to go pound sand. The German counterattack broke. The combination of losing their Tiger support and running into unexpectedly fierce resistance from troops like Ernest Smith meant their assault stalled and then fell apart. The Canadian positions held, the line was maintained, and what could have been a disaster turned into a defensive victory. And at the center of it all was this private from Hamilton, Ontario, who had just done something that seemed literally impossible. When word got back about what Ernest Smith had done, his officers could barely believe it. Taking out one Tiger with a PIAT was nearly unheard of. Taking out two while wounded and under heavy fire, that was the stuff of legend. The Canadian Army knew they had witnessed something extraordinary, and Ernest Smith was awarded the Victoria Cross, which is the highest military decoration for valor in the British Commonwealth. The citation for his Victoria Cross tells the basic facts, but it can't really capture the sheer audacity and courage of what he did. Standing up to a Tiger tank with a PIAT isn't brave, it's beyond brave. It's either crazy or heroic, or both at the same time. Now here's something fascinating about Ernest Smith's story that doesn't always get mentioned. After the war, he didn't become some famous celebrity or spend his life giving speeches about his heroism. He went back to Canada, settled in Vancouver, and went back to being a regular guy. He worked, he raised a family, he lived a quiet life. People who knew him said he didn't talk much about the war, and when he did, he'd downplay what happened. That's such a common thread with real heroes, isn't it? The people who do the most incredible things under fire are often the ones who are most humble about it afterward. Ernest Smith didn't think he was special. He thought he was just doing his job, protecting his friends, and doing what needed to be done. But let's talk about the bigger picture here, because Ernest Smith's actions that day represent something really important about the Italian campaign and the Canadian contribution to World War II. The Italian campaign doesn't get the same attention as D-Day or the Battle of Britain or some of the other famous operations, but it was brutal and it was critical. The Allies were fighting their way up the Italian peninsula against German forces, who had every advantage when it came to terrain and defensive positions. Canadian troops were right in the thick of it, fighting through mountains and rivers and fortified towns and taking heavy casualties. The Seaforth Highlanders alone lost hundreds of men during the Italian campaign, and units like them were doing the hard, grinding work of pushing the Germans back. Ernest Smith's stand with the PIAT also highlights something about infantry combat that's easy to overlook. We often think about World War II in terms of big operations, massive tank battles, aerial bombardments, but so much of the war came down to individual soldiers making split-second decisions in the worst possible circumstances. Ernest Smith didn't have time to call for backup, or wait for orders, or consult with anyone. He saw the threat, he had the tool, even if it was a terrible tool, and he acted. That combination of courage, initiative, and skill under pressure is what made the difference between victory and defeat in countless small actions throughout the war. There's also something poetic about the weapon he used. The PIAT was unloved, it was mocked, it was considered inadequate, and yet in the hands of someone brave enough and determined enough, it got the job done. Ernest Smith proved that even the worst equipment can be effective if the person using it has enough guts. That's not to say the PIAT was suddenly good, it wasn't, but it shows that hardware is only part of the equation. The human factor, the willingness to stand and fight even when everything seems hopeless, that's what matters most. After the war, the story of Ernest Smith and his PIAT became part of Canadian military lore. New recruits in the Canadian forces would learn about him in their training, not just as a lesson in courage, but as an example of what's possible when you refuse to give up. The Victoria Cross citation hangs in military museums. His name appears in history books, and people still study that action near the Savio River, trying to understand exactly how he pulled it off. Military analysts have looked at the engagement, and the general consensus is that it was a combination of skill, timing, and a whole lot of luck, but luck favors the bold right. Ernest Smith made his own luck by being willing to do what everyone else thought was impossible. There's a human element to this story that we can't ignore either. Ernest Smith was 20 years old when this happened. 20. Most 20-year-olds today are in college or just starting their careers, trying to figure out their lives, and here's this kid standing up to Tiger tanks in the middle of a war zone. What does that say about his generation? They grew up during the Depression, they went straight into the worst war in human history, and they did things that seem unbelievable to us now. Ernest Smith wasn't unique in his generation. There were thousands of young men just like him who did extraordinary things because their circumstances demanded it. But his story stands out because it's so visceral, so immediate. You can picture that moment when he stood up, cocked the PIAT, and took aim at that tiger. The technical details of how the PIAT bombs penetrated the tiger's armor are interesting too, because they tell us something about the vulnerabilities of even the most powerful weapons. The Tiger tank was incredible, but it wasn't invincible. Its side and rear armor was thinner than the front, and if you got close enough and hit the right spot, you could knock it out. The PIAT's shaped charge warhead was actually pretty effective at close range. The problem was getting close enough and surviving long enough to take the shot. Ernest Smith solved that problem by essentially not caring about his own safety. He got close, he aimed well, and he hit his targets. The Tigers probably never expected to be threatened by infantry with PIATs because most infantry wouldn't even try. One detail that often gets lost in retellings of this story is what happened to Ernest after he was wounded. He refused medical evacuation until the situation was stabilized. Even after taking out 2 Tigers and fighting off German infantry, while wounded he still wouldn't leave his post until he was sure his unit was safe. That level of dedication is hard to comprehend. Most people would be thinking about survival, about getting to safety, about getting their wounds treated, but Ernest was still focused on the mission, on his buddies, on holding that line. It wasn't until officers basically ordered him to get medical attention that he finally left his position. The impact of Ernest Smith's actions rippled beyond just that one engagement. When soldiers in other units heard about what happened, it boosted morale across the board. If one guy with a PIAT could take out 2 Tigers, then maybe the Tigers weren't as invincible as everyone thought. Maybe the Germans could be beaten, maybe the odds weren't as impossible as they seemed. Psychological warfare works both ways, and Ernest Smith's stand was a psychological victory for the Allies just as much as it was a tactical one. The Germans lost 2 tigers, they lost the momentum of their attack, and they lost a little bit of that aura of invincibility that the Tiger tank had built up. Ernest Smith survived the war and lived until 1984. He passed away in Vancouver at the age of 69, and his funeral was attended by veterans, dignitaries, and people who wanted to pay their respects to a genuine hero. His Victoria Cross is on display, and his story is still taught in Canadian military schools. But what strikes me most about Ernest Smith is that he never sought fame or glory. He did what he thought was right in the moment, and then he went back to living his life. That's the mark of real character, doing the incredible and then not making a big deal about it. There are so many lessons we can take from Ernest Smith's story. Courage isn't about being fearless, it's about being afraid and doing it anyway. Heroism isn't about seeking glory, it's about protecting the people around you. Sometimes the worst tool is still enough if you're determined enough to use it. And maybe most importantly, ordinary people are capable of extraordinary things when the situation demands it. Ernest Smith wasn't a superhero. He was a regular guy from Hamilton who found himself in an impossible situation and decided he wasn't going to let his friends die without a fight. The story of Ernest Smith and the Tiger tanks is one of those moments in history that reminds us what individuals are capable of. In the grand sweep of World War II, his action was a tiny moment, just one man in one engagement on one day in October 1944. But for the men in that position with him, it was everything. It was the difference between life and death, between holding the line and being overrun, between victory and defeat. That's what combat comes down to in the end, not the grand strategies or the big picture, but individual acts of courage by people like Ernest Smith who refused to quit. So yeah, the young Canadian who destroyed a Tiger tank with a PIAT wasn't some elite soldier with special training and perfect equipment. He was a 20-year-old private with a weapon everyone hated, facing down the most feared tank in the German army. And he won. He stood his ground, he took his shots, and he stopped an attack that could have changed the course of that battle. That's the story of Ernest Alvia Smith, Victoria Cross recipient, and one of the most unlikely tank killers in military history. His legacy lives on every time someone faces impossible odds and decides to fight anyway. That's what heroes do, and that's exactly what Ernest Smith was, whether he'd admit it or not.